All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessie Wales, and I will be moderating today's webinar about how to write your best grant for the upcoming IRL/NEP small grants. How today is going to work is you will notice that the Q&A feature is available in the chat feature, and I believe the voice feature has been disabled. So as we go through the presentations today, please go ahead and ask any and all questions you have in the Q&A section. We will be sure to answer them after all of the speakers have gone. So today we are going to start out with a couple of our grant writers that we have on staff, and then follow it up with information from our grant manager, Daniel, about the upcoming grants. Unfortunately, Kelly McGee with Natural Strategies could not be here with us today, but she did go ahead and pre-record her presentation. So we will bring that up and play that for you now.
Good afternoon. My name is Kelly McGee, and I'm president of Natural Strategies. I'm also the executive director of the Riverside Conservancy, and I'm here this afternoon to share a few tips on successful grant writing. So as we get started, I'll share some of the basics, the who, what, where, when, why, and how we write successful grants. So I think one of the most important things to consider when you're preparing your grant proposal is knowing who is granting the funding for the project. We should all get to know the grantor, or who is providing funds for each project. And knowing our funder is really more than just knowing how the organization is structured. We really want to know who's going to be reviewing these grant applications, who's going to be ranking them, who are the funder's stakeholders. So for example, do you know who is on the Citizens Advisory Committee? And successful grant proposals will tell a story of how your organization, also called the grantee, once you receive the grant, how you will fulfill an unmet need of the grantor. So for purposes of this presentation, we're going to use the example of the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program as the funder for the small grants program. So we're going to be using that grant proposal, or that grant request for proposals, as our example today. And we really want to know what is important to the grantor. So in this case, we know the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program really is focused on attaining a healthy lagoon. And we do that by improving water quality, or habitat quality, and we do that by reaching out to the widest audience that we can. In the case of the grantor, community engagement is really critical, especially for this small grants program. And how do we provide community engagement? Well, we can include volunteer support. We can include engagement with many different organizations. And one way we show that is by providing letters of support from local agencies, clubs, or schools. So if you have a project, and let's say you're requesting $5,000 to restore a shoreline, how many local organizations will support you in that endeavor? And those are really important to include in any grant proposal, because it shows that you have a foundation of support for your project. And then, of course, you want to tell your story. What is your story? Why is your story urgent? Why is your project urgent to improving the Indian River Lagoon and its watershed? What is your mission? What is your scope? And how does that mission and scope dovetail with the mission and the scope of the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program? So you really want to know what is important to your grantor, and then have a really well-written summary of your project. There is a fairly easy way to know what your grantor, in this case the National Estuary Program, needs to do. They have created a CCMP, Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan, which is linked in the RFP to the small grants application. And it's very clear what the Indian River Lagoon Council hopes to achieve. They have established a vision. In the future, they want to see what is a healthy ecosystem. They want to see healthy communities. They want to see healthy economies. And they have elaborated on that vision into mission, promise, and goals. And they have established every single one of these in a really easy to digest framework. The graphic on this slide is an illustration of the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program vital signs. This is contained within the 10-year Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan for the Indian River Lagoon, the CCMP, which is linked in the request for proposals for these small grant projects. And I really encourage everyone to go to that document. It's online, and really get to know these vital signs. These vital signs will share with you what the priorities are of the National Estuary Program and help you identify deliverables as well as outcomes. So the further you are out on the spokes of this wheel, the more detail the deliverables, and then as you go in towards the center of the vital sign wheel, you'll see that the ultimate goal is the healthy lagoon. So as you're preparing grants, it's good to know what is the vision, what is the overall thing that you're trying to achieve, and make sure that the action steps that you are putting in your proposal will help further the goals of the National Estuary Program. So what is the need? What is the funder trying to solve? And we know from a lot of the reports that the National Estuary Program has out, we can see the water quality trends. We can see what's happening with seagrasses. We know what's happening with many of the different species that call the estuary home. And so again, you can look at that, the vital sign wheel, and you can see very clearly what this funder, the National Estuary Program, what are the problems that they're trying to solve. And then as you're writing your grant, figure out how is your project going to help solve this problem. And that's where you can list your outputs or deliverables. Outputs and deliverables can be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative deliverables are things that you can identify and measure. For example, what are the number of trees that you're going to plant? How many volunteers are you going to have? And be mindful of how you're going to identify them. So if they're qualitative outcomes, things that you don't have a tangible measurement for, think about how are you going to show the National Estuary Program that your project was a success. Can you show photos of the activity? Can you write articles to go in your local newspaper? Can you conduct volunteer surveys? So you can be very creative with how you're going to report your outputs or deliverables, but you must have them for any successful grant application. This is an illustration of a shoreline planting. So the deliverables are very specific. X number of plants over so many linear feet. Those are great examples of deliverables you can put into your grant proposal. So where is your project located? Can you identify on the map where you are in relation to the entire Indian River Lagoon? And you should also have a really good schedule for implementing every single phase of your project. How are you going to measure it, and how are you going to report back on it? And so why should your grantor fund your project? What lagoon need does your project solve? And again, I keep coming back to what are the needs of the grantor, but that's really critical. And it's also really helpful to identify what are the outcomes. Are you trying to improve the water quality within the lagoon? Are you trying to establish more aquatic habitat? And why is your project critical to helping the lagoon? And also know that every proposal is scored and ranked. And just because your project needs funding doesn't mean that it is sufficient to meet the needs of the grantor. How well does your project fit the grant requirements? So I would say go through the instructions in the grant very, very specifically. And usually the instructions in a grant request for proposals will give you the keys to success. It will tell you exactly how to document your successes. For example, with the small grants program, they want to know how will your grant lead to a healthy lagoon? What kind of reports are you going to provide? So everyone has to provide a final report. Is it going to be digital photos? Are you going to create brochures, videos, manuals, signage? If your project is restoration oriented, are you going to be able to show before and after photos? And if your project is education in nature, you will have to show what are your training materials. Do you have manuals? All of those things need to be able to be submitted to the Indian River Lagoon Council. They have to be able to show that your project was a great use of public funding. And then what are the outcomes? As opposed to what are the outputs, which are the specific measurements, the outcomes are really, are we hoping to prevent erosion? Are we enhancing habitat? Are we reducing stormwater pollution? Are we improving water quality? So those are also things that you'll need to describe within any good grant proposal. And then how do you ensure a successful proposal? So again, you'll want to pay very close attention to those grant requirements and how many points are awarded in each section. So for example, again, with the case of the small grants program, 30% will be scored on the strength of proposal. How well does your project contribute towards restoring or improving the Indian River Lagoon or advancing lagoon education? 20% of the application is the ability and the qualifications of the applicant. 10% is cost justification, but cost, just because it's 10% doesn't mean it's not important. Every single plant should have a price. You should be able to justify and document every single expense that you have. So that's an example. Demonstration of community support is also important, as well as benefits to priority population. So again, refer back to that request for proposals for all the keys to the success for your proposal, and try to ensure you're going to have a wide audience or participation base, and identify very specifically how does the grantor know that you are going to fulfill your obligations. Do you have people on your team that have done this type of project before? That would be really helpful. And even if you don't have anyone on your team, do you have folks in your community that would be willing to commit to helping you make sure your project is a success? And that's another important reason to include letters of support from agencies or universities that have a lot of expertise and that can help ensure the success of your project. And then finally, keep in mind the big picture. One lagoon. We want a healthy lagoon, and telling your story and having your story be part of the lagoon story is really important. So Things to ask yourself: is your grant proposal urgent? Is it specific? Is it accurate? And is it credible? And if you do those things, you're well on your way to a successful grant. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Kelly, when you watch this recording, since you're not here today. Next up, we have Mark Brewer from the Angie Brewer Company. Mark, if you would like to go ahead and camera on, he's going to be walking us through the actual grant application.
So I tried to turn the video on. It says it's not enabled, but I think actually if we could pull up the PDF for the grant application kit, that would be helpful.
Perfect. We'll go ahead and do that. Also, I'll be sending the direct link in the chat box, so if you want to follow along at home.
So if we can go to the very top, that would be helpful. Okay, so one of the very first things, and even though it's in the middle of the page, that I like to point out is it doesn't do any good at all to put a lot of effort into an application if you miss the deadline. And so really, really pay attention to the fact that it's not at midnight. It's at 5 p.m. on March 25th. And with that, I'm going to recommend that you draft that and make sure that you really plan to be done no later than the 23rd, and engage some folks that might be involved in your project or in your organization to take a look at that, and make sure there aren't any, misstatements or any issues with the application. And because you also want to make sure that you're eligible for the project. And so looks like I can turn my video on now. Thank you. And because one of the things you have to make sure is that you are an eligible applicant. We'd hate for you to waste time and effort and not know that your organization would be a viable applicant. The most important thing to point out is that an individual cannot be a recipient or a grantee. You can do that in conjunction with a group or nonprofit, community engagement group, or schools, things like that. It is pointed out in the application who's eligible, so I would point you to that to make sure that you understand that. The other thing is that it's a maximum of $5,000. So regardless of what activity you want to do, maybe there'd be some discussion about if it's part of a larger project or something a little bit later on, but this grant maximum is 5,000. And so you want to make sure you stay within that budgetary limit. The other thing I want to point out, and Kelly did a great job of kind of giving the overarching look at everything, is looking at some of the details. So one detail that you're going to want to make sure, and we'll talk about a little bit later too, is that there are limitations. One limitation is one proposal per funding cycle per organization. I think Daniel will go into that a little more detail as well. I also want to point out, anytime you're doing a grant proposal or an application for a grant, you really want to consider the reviewers. And when you write up your information, you want to make sure that it's succinct, straightforward, and to the point. You really want to catch their attention in a very short period of time. I usually use a 30-second rule. And so if I write something up and I show it to somebody and they're not interested, or going, oh, yeah, that sounds pretty interesting, or I'd like to see how that would come out, you might want to punch up your information a little bit, because you will have to get the attention of the reviewer pretty quickly through the process. We can go down a little bit as I talk about the next thing, is that the time period for evaluation is going to be not concluded before the 13th of May, I believe it is. So you want to make sure that, as excited as you might be to move forward and, do things, that you consider that this evaluation process is something the staff and the council take very seriously. And it does take quite a bit of time. You might imagine they might get hundreds of proposals. So be mindful and respectful of that. They will conclude the process at their earliest opportunity, and they're trying to work against deadlines as well. And we can go down a little bit more. So it's really important to make sure that you align with the goals and objectives. And so Kelly had mentioned the CCMP. There is a link in the document. You'll want to look at that because you do want to understand how your project is going to relate to the goals and objectives. And so we can pass along that. I don't want to reiterate it too much. And so when you're looking at your categories, just make sure they fall well within one of these. And then procurement is really where I wanted to touch on some things as well. An important note is that this project or these funds are reimbursement only, meaning that you should consider that you have the ability to fully complete and fully expend the dollars. When you do your final report, there will be a final invoice to capture those costs and get them reimbursed. And so you also want to think about the type of costs that you include in your budget. Indirect expenses are not ones that can be included. And so direct expenses, think about it this way: if you have spent the money and have a receipt, that would be a direct expense. An indirect expense would not necessarily be something like that. So you want to make sure that you fill your budget out correctly a little bit later on, but keep in mind, and they've been nice enough to show you the types of things that are actually eligible. And so we can move on past that, I believe. And another thing I want to point out, we can go just a little bit further down, is that not all organizations, especially for-profit businesses and even some nonprofits, are not used to dealing with some of the state and federal requirements. In this case, state requirements, things like public entity crimes, non-lobbying. You do have some rights to protest, right? And then they have a right to accept or reject. And then contingencies. So a lot of times folks will put together a budget and maybe the costs aren't as hard as they would like them to be, or thinking something might change. In this particular program, you can't put a contingency in. It means it's undefined, therefore it can't be evaluated. And so you want to be careful of that. And one example might be saying, well, I've got $4,000 worth of definable costs, but I think there might be an escalation, or we might be able to do more. So I'm going to put $1,000 contingency to get up to 5,000. That's not going to be how you want to address this particular grant application. Okay, we can go down a little bit more. Okay. I know I said it already, but I'm going to say it again. Please don't wait till the last minute, because there will be technical difficulties that come up in almost every program. Maybe you have a outage or something on your internet, or the PDF file that you're trying to create just doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So I would urge anyone submitting an application anywhere to do so well before the 5 o'clock deadline. Even we generally try to do it 1 to 2 days before the deadline, if that's a possibility. And keep that in mind, because then that allows you to recover from any kind of technical difficulty you might go into. I touched on it just a little bit before, but there is a final written report upon completion of the project, and a final invoice, things like that. Make sure you keep all your receipts and things. One thing I wanted to point out too is it's very important. I know there's a lot of excitement about moving forward on your project, but unless there's a fully executed, meaning every party has signed the grant agreement, don't begin your project or your expenditures prior to that, because anything before the date it's fully signed by all parties, those items will not be reimbursable, and you'll have spent money that could have been reimbursed, but the timing caused you a problem. So please be careful there. We can go a little bit farther down, I think. She touched on that, so I'm not going to dig too much into that. We can keep going. While we're moving down, one of the things I want, yeah, right here is good. If you are doing plantings, they've been nice enough to put a lot of different resources. You can't just plant anything, so please pay attention to that if that's the type of project you're going to do. The other thing is the eligible costs are important, but knowing what's not going to be eligible, meaning it won't be reimbursed, is as important, maybe sometimes more important. And so if you're looking to use that for ongoing administrative support or reimbursement for costs outside of your scope of work, that's just not going to be possible. So one of the things I want to point out is be very careful to put everything you need in your scope of work, because later you can't come back and say, hey, I want to do this other thing with the money. It's just not how this will work. Obviously, entertainment, bad debts, interest and financing costs, things like that wouldn't be something that you could reimburse. And I have seen different kinds of projects where folks are like, oh, let's have an event and we'll do t-shirts and things like that. And that's not something that will fit in this particular program. It may for something else, but not for this. We can keep going. Location of the project is going to be really critical. So if your project doesn't fall within the area, or you have any questions, maybe you're on the fringe, we suggest you send those questions to Aaron Bergman, and you'll see at the bottom of the page right here the email address where you can make that contact. It's incredibly important to make sure you're not going to be operating or doing your project outside of the area. And so we can keep going. I'm not going to go into detail on every bit of the application, but I can tell you a little trick, even back from when I was a very young man in the Army. The reason there's a form field is because that information is a question that must be answered. So don't leave any blanks. If you don't know the answer, maybe it's NA or none, but do your best to make sure that it's complete, correct, and accurate, and everything is filled out. And you can keep going. There's just a little point I want to make about one. Okay, so in some of the questions, and this has actually happened to a lot of folks, make sure you know your word limitations. It's very disheartening to spend hours and hours and hours coming up with thousands of words that you can't present, and then paring those down is not much fun to meet a limitation. So you want to make sure that your statements are straightforward and they fit that. I'll give you a little tip. If you are using Word, Microsoft Word, you can actually select the text, and down at the bottom left of the screen, it'll have a little count there. You can click on that and it will tell you how many words that are selected. So you can make sure you stay within that word count. And that's pretty much kind of the tips and tricks that I have for you guys, and I'll hang out and participate in any questions as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. We appreciate it. And then next up is going to be Dan. He's going to be going over the actual grant itself with some tips and tricks from past grantors. So Dan, if you're ready to go.
Alrighty, so thanks Kelly and Mark. They made my job quite a bit easier. What I'm going to touch on, and if there's any duplication, it's because it's very important. So you might hear a few things over that Mark and Kelly really touched on already. But the goal of this is to kind of really give you a full look at our small grants program. We do also have 4 recurring large grant proposal categories that are released each year. However, those requests are now closed and they won't open up again until the fall timeframe. So we'll just start in. I'm going to go over a quick little outline of the topics I plan to cover, and so that any applicant can be successful in preparing, submitting, and hopefully being awarding. First, we're going to go over what types of projects are eligible for the small grant program. Next, we're going to look at who is eligible, and Mark kind of touched on that a little bit already, but I'm going to kind of really dig into it. We're then going to review the application sections, and you kind of saw that as Mark was talking about the application itself, and we got down into those fillable PDF. We're going to go through each section so you can see how to do that. We're then going to go over timelines, which is really important. And lastly, we will answer some questions that you may have. So the first thing you want to do before starting your application is you have this project idea, and you want to make sure it's compatible with this small grant. And so any of the comprehensive conservation management plan vital signs may be addressed, and Kelly kind of really went very well into this. So when you're thinking about, there's really 2 main types of projects that can be submitted, and they're either going to be restoration focused or they're going to be education focused. And for restoration, we're kind of thinking that top left blue and the top of the blue section of this wheel. For these projects, the location of the project must be clearly defined. And this is actually important for all projects, not just restoration, but education as well. They must take place in our watershed. And Mark just mentioned, and Kelly mentioned earlier, the map. It's on page 8 in that application. And if you have any kind of questions, you're thinking, this might be right on the edge of that line, please send a question to Aaron Bergman at irlcouncil.org, and we'll get that squared away. Any restoration project must also take place, and this is key, on a community-owned, like a HOA, church, etc., public-owned, or conservation easement lands. It cannot happen on private property. If you're going to do it on that type of land, you need to have a letter of permission or support from that landowner included in your application. For education type proposals, the project must be focused on IRL issues, stressors, and/or solutions. The target audience must clearly be defined, and how are you going to measure the success of your project? An example could be pre and post assessment test. More information about each type of proposal can be found on pages 2 and 3 of the application. So now that you have a type, and it's either restoration, education, or it could actually be both, there's essentially 5 different categories that project could fit into. And so there's lagoon awareness and education, and some examples of this could include programs for schools, YMCA groups, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, or other types of youth organizations, programs involving youth and finding solutions to lagoon problems, programs for underrepresented youth, those types of things. The second category is improving water quality or reducing nutrient loading. Some examples include fertilizer reduction campaigns, native plant gardening, rain gardens, rain barrels, citizen scientists to monitor ponds, outfalls, those types of programs. The third category is habitat restoration and protection. Kelly showed a really good example of that in her presentation with all that planting at that park there on that shoreline. Some other examples could be oyster restoration, enhancement of seawalls, projects addressing seagrasses, mangroves, wetlands, and marine debris and microplastics reduction recycling initiatives. This fourth category actually kind of ties in with that third category a little bit. You have your trash-free waters and wildlife conservation, So examples include improving awareness of threats to wildlife from monofilament fishing line, doing coastal cleanups, protecting seagrass beds, education about fish and wildlife habitats, those types of projects. And the last category is invasive species. And so some examples of this type of category could include eradication of invasive plants or animals, education about these harmful animals or species and how to prevent their spread, discouraging releasing of unwanted exotic pets, those types of projects. All right, I'm sorry. Let's talk about who is eligible to submit an application. As Mark mentioned earlier, individuals are not eligible recipients, so there has to be some type of organizational structure in place. So when you think of a school, it's not going to be the teacher, it's going to be the school board, school district, or whatever the official organization name is in that organization. You have community groups such as churches, civic groups, nonprofits, those types of organizations. We have homeowners or condo associations or other types of housing associations. The fourth group would be businesses, so any limited liability corporation or incorporated business would be eligible. And lastly, we have any type of local government agency or university, if, with a caveat, that there is a strong volunteer or community involvement component and it is outlined in the proposal. And as we mentioned earlier, no indirect costs are requested. One thing I want to stress again is that there is a proposal limitation. So no more than one proposal per organization may be submitted. So if more than one proposal is received, the first proposal will be accepted and the later ones will be returned without being reviewed. So if you're part of a larger group, make sure you have internal discussions to determine which proposal you wish to submit on behalf of that organization. All right, so we're going to kind of go back into the application itself and look at each of the fillable sections and kind of give you a little bit of guidance on how to fill that out. The first page is pretty straightforward, and here's what it looks like. And we'll just go top to bottom. So first you want to have the name of your project. What is the organization's name? And who? So this is going to be whoever's applying for the grant funds. Who's going to be the grantee? And you must have the authority to submit on behalf of your organization, and you can't submit on behalf of another organization. So if you're with one group and you're submitting for somebody else, that's not going to work. So make sure you have authority and for that organization. Next, you want to put in the organization's street address, city, county, zip. Who is the organization's executive director or president or superintendent? Whoever has that signature authority should be listed here, their phone and their email as well. Next, list the project lead or manager. If it's the same as that executive director or lead person for the agency, just write them in again. As Mark stressed, don't want to leave any blanks. If something doesn't apply, just write NA. You want to list your organization type, and we kind of just already went over those eligible groups I mentioned, like the school, HOA, business, university, etc. The next line is for any partners. Again, if there are none, it's all internal, or it's say volunteers. You can put NA or volunteers. Under your total amount requested, list how much you are requesting. And this is key. This should match the budget table at the end of this application. We use the budget table to determine the appropriate award amount and not this line if it is different. Next line is asking you if you receive partial funding, how would that impact your project? Can you still move forward with it? Would the project be limited? Those types of things should be answered here. Next, list the start and end date of the project. And this is key. This should fall within that timeline I plan to go over in just a little bit. If it's wildly different than that, this could negatively impact your application. Next question is simple yes or no regarding have you applied for other funding, and this is at the time of submission. So if the answer is no, just please put NA in the next box. If it's pending, just put pending. Next, you want to list the project county location, first by city and county, and then in the last box, the GPS coordinates. If there's multiple, list as many as possible. Try to list as much as you know. I know some things may still be pending, but just put as much information there as you possibly can. So next in the application is really just a question for us to help us understand where you heard about this program, and helps us maybe know what's working on getting the message out, maybe what's not working, so we can help better engage the community in this opportunity. Next, choose what type of project the proposal addresses. It's education, restoration, or it could be both. Section 3, we want to give a brief description of the project. And Mark did a really good job of this, saying, 300 words. And if it doesn't catch somebody in that first 300 words, you're probably going to lose them. So that's why we have this limitation here. Really be succinct and get people's interest in this first box here. The follow-up question is to summarize, how this will contribute to restoring the IRL. If it's restoration, that could include listing the benefits of the restoration, such as nutrient reduction or improved habitat for animals. If it's education, you could have an example of potential behavior change or increased stewardship, something along those lines. Section 4 asks you to list your partners, volunteers that will be part of this project. How will they be utilized in the project? What's their role? How will you recruit them? Section 5 asks you to give us a description of what makes your organization qualified to do this project, how you will be successful. A good job of answering this would be giving examples of past work. That would be appropriate here. Section 6 wants you to estimate your project reach. How many people will it impact? And this could vary greatly. Just be sure to have something that is realistic and backed up when making your estimations. Section 7 asks, how will you measure the success of your project? This could be through monitoring of a restoration site. It could be percent still living of plants or animals that you did for restoration. It could be a pre and post water quality test results. If it's education, it could be something like a pre and post learning assessment or other measurable means of education. Section 8 asks how the participants who implement this project or are part of the learning portion, what do they plan to learn from it? What do you expect them to get out of this project? And the follow-up question is similar to Section 3. So this gives you kind of an opportunity to elaborate on that other section if you didn't have enough space there. Section 9 wants you to list the materials and supplies you will need to implement this project, and that will be provided to participants. So this should really match what you have in your budget table, and a little bit more on that later. Section 10 asks you to outline any benefits to underrepresented communities, or as we like to call them, priority communities. And if you're unsure if the community you're going to do your project in is an identified priority community, you can actually find them all in our 2023 bill or bipartisan infrastructure law long-term strategic plan, which can be found on our website at onelagoon.org under the resources tab. This last section before we get to the budget table is asking if this project is part of a larger effort or ongoing project. And if so, how does this small grant fit in that overall effort? And this is important because you'll see as we get to the budget table, knowing how this fits into a larger will help us understand the costs and where this project fits in the overall timeline of, say, a larger project. So if it's not, then what is the long-term sustainability of this project? Do you plan to do more workshops? Do you plan to monitor the restored areas? Answering those types of questions would be appropriate here. And then lastly, we have the budget table. Remember, match is not required, but if you do plan to have match, you need to list it in the match column in the row of the appropriate cost item. And this will help reviewers see that complete picture, especially if it's a rather large project, as I just mentioned in question 11. Please note, having as precise as possible cost is required. If the cost item is personnel, it needs to be an hourly rate and a number of hours estimated. If it's supplies, you should list each item and its estimated cost and number needed for it. One thing I'd like to note is that do as much detail as you can, because we do allow the flexibility where, say you don't need quite as many beauty berries as shown in this table, but you need more paintbrushes, for example. You can move some funding between those line items, but if you don't have an item listed and then you all of a sudden buy something that's not in this table, it's not going to be reimbursable. And so, as you can see here, the top table is kind of a good example showing you all the different costs, and the bottom table doesn't have all that detail that would be helpful. So now you're wondering, well, okay, I've filled out the application. How's it going to be scored? Kelly went into it a little bit in her presentation. There is on page 6 of the application all the selection criteria and the weight of those criteria, so you can know how much reviewers' weight of their scores will be on certain sections. So writing your answers in these 11 sections and in the budget and knowing how they're going to be weighted will help you get the best possible score. All right, let's talk timelines. As Mark hammered in already, the first date is the most important one. Anything after that is really not important if you didn't meet that first one. And it is the submission deadline of March 25th, 2024 by 5 p.m. And I'm going to stress, this is receive time, not the date that you hit submit on your computer. I can tell you from our larger grants, we've had some folks that said, I submitted it at 3 o'clock. Well, we didn't receive it. Their network had an error or something happened. So definitely submit early and get a confirmation that it was received before the deadline. Because if you don't, then none of these other timelines are going to matter. So the second most important date is the notice of award, which should be on May 13th, 2024. We usually send out a notice of decision. That's a Friday, that May 13th. I'll send out a no decision on the Monday following. And then, as you see here, contracting is the next timeline, and that'll happen immediately after the rights for protest ends. Another really key important time is your project start date. So if your project has not started or you're not contracted by 6 months after the award date, or this November 13th as shown here, the IRL Council may terminate your contract or rescind the award. And lastly is the project completion date. So that it says it must be completed with 1 year of award, and in this instance that would be May 12th, 2025. So if you're filling out your application and your project period is outside of this time frame, you may want to rethink your project. And with that, I'll go ahead and take some questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. That was fantastic. We did receive some questions in our chat while we were doing this. Let me go ahead and pop this up. I'm going to leave this screen up so that for those of us who are watching after the fact, you know where to email your questions just in case we weren't able to answer them live. So you did go ahead and answer the first question. How long does it take to find out who won the Small Grants Award? And you said that would be May 13th, correct?
That's when the council makes its decisions, and you could, email me, but we send out a no decision the following Monday. So probably the 16th, I guess, would be the appropriate day you would hear back.
Awesome. That works. Next question. Can I partner with another teacher on my small grants application?
Sure. I don't see why you couldn't. Just remember that you, as the teacher, are not the grantee. It would be the school board. So you can partner with another teacher and be awarded, but it's going to go to that school board. Now, if this is, I want to partner with another teacher out of another school board or school district, you probably want to determine who's going to be the primary and who's going to be, the grantee in that instance. But I don't see any reason why you can't partner.
Okay, perfect. So partnering within your school, partnering outside your school or outside your organization, totally feasible. You just have to decide which one is going to be the principal investigator on the grant.
Correct. And then make sure, and remember we mentioned there's a proposal limitation, one per organization. So if say your school board already submitted a proposal, then maybe having the partner be that submitter would be more appropriate.
That makes sense. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Um, can small grants support student stipends for internships?
Yes, they can.
All right, nice and easy. I did notice on there too that there is a salary line. So just in case you have instructors, students, etc., they can get paid for their time, which is pretty awesome.
Yep, just be specific, how many hours and what that rate's going to be, or if it's a fixed stipend, how many students are and what that fixed rate would be. So just be specific.
I like it. It's easier. It's better to be a little bit more specific than it is to be vague in this grant, I feel.
Yeah, don't just say stipends 1,000,
Gotcha.
say stipend 500, 2 people, something like that.
Perfect. How many grants are awarded to an individual department within local government agencies? Specifically, this question is coming from St. Lucie County.
So if St. Lucie County is the applicant, only one per applicant. So even though there's many different divisions and public works, parks and rec, utilities, there are all these different divisions, the award would still be with the St. Lucie County Board of County Commissioners. So it's one.
Just one. Okay, good to know. Um, can we use the IRLNEP grant writing support to write this grants proposal?
No, you can't use our grant writers for our own grants. You can use it for any other grant opportunity. And just to reiterate, the key things you have to do, you have to do a little homework beforehand. You have to identify the grant you want to go after and have an idea of the project that you want to do. So kind of like a quick little brief summary of that project and the grant that you want to go to. And then all you have to do is send us a message saying, I'd like to apply to this grant. Can I get some grant writing help? We'll reach out to the grant writer and then hand them off to you after they have given us a proposal. No cost to the applicant. We take the grant writer's costs and pay that for you. So that's the only key. You can't apply to ours though.
Shucks, so close. But other ones, we got you covered. So if my proposal is an education project and I plan to deliver education to 5 or more groups at their physical locations, should I list all 5 addresses or just the physical address of our organization where the educational material is being created?
So you're going to want a little bit of both. So in the application front page, the organization's address where you'll be doing all your work, I guess. And then project location, and you can just use GPS coordinates. So I know because it gets busy when you're trying to add the whole address in that little box, just GPS coordinates will make it easy.
Perfect. All right. And if this is a follow-up to that, if you don't have an idea, if you're not completely sure on your partners yet, but you know that your project wants to work with 5 local schools, is that okay? Can I still apply for funding without having a solid idea of who's going to be going at it with me? That was a weird.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
I think it may hurt you a little bit on your scores. The reviewers may not take as well to that as if you had it all lined up, but there's nothing to say you can't do that.
Okay, perfect. There's a little bit of confusion about how to submit the grant. So there was a paragraph that went by that said that you needed to submit an electronic copy and a hard copy. Is that accurate, or will just the electronic copy suffice?
Just the electronic.
Just the electronic. Okay, so we
Yeah.
don't submit a hard copy whatsoever.
No, it's electronic PDF, and just by email.
Okay. Can you describe how the proposals get evaluated, including how they are scored?
Sure. So if you look at page 6 of the application, there is the selection criteria. And so The reviewers will look at that and go through all the sections, those 11 sections that I went over, as well as the budget table, and they have essentially 100 points that they can allocate. 30 points come from strength of proposal. So this is, how well did you answer all the questions? How well is your project going to contribute towards restoring the IRL or advancing education? What is the extent to which it addresses a need? So Kelly mentioned urgency. That's going to be here. 20% is the qualifications or ability of the applicant. So remember I said, answering how qualified you are, maybe by past performance or similar projects, your partner's capabilities. If you don't have that, lean on them. That's 20% of your score right there. Cost justification. So is your budget table really well defined, detailed? You're going to get 10% of your score there. 20% is from the goals and objectives. How well did you state those? How well are you targeting Lagoon issues and educating your community? That's 20%. Do you actually have community support? Are you going to have volunteers? Do you have some buy-in, letters of support, those type of things? That's 15% of your score. And then 5% would be those underrepresented or priority communities, as we mentioned. So, if you're hitting that, you're going to get an extra little boost as well. And that's it.
Awesome. And is that rubric available online?
It is. It's on page 6 of the application.
Fantastic. So to repeat, if collaborating with several organizations who are actively educating about the IRL, and the lead organization is running a summer camp program that encourages underserved youth to engage with the IRL, will I need each partner to sign or provide a letter of support? And what are some other key considerations I should account for in the narrative?
Ooh, it's a good one. It can't hurt to have those letters of support. You're not going to need them unless they are providing any kind of financial or volunteer effort. So, if they're part of your budget, you probably should include them. Okay. Any other considerations? Just, definitely mention it in your narrative, in your sections that you're going to fill out in the application. Talk about all that work that's been done prior. But remember, as Mark mentioned, anything before the contract signed isn't reimbursable. It may help you in your narrative and help reviewers understand that this is a ongoing project. Kind of that larger project that we mentioned, that last question, that would be a really good area to kind of talk about this project and all the other collaborators that you have.
All right, perfect. How do you submit a PDF of diagrams of the project and photos beforehand?
What do you mean, like?
So since PDF is like a fill-in thing, there's no way to really import photos into it. Should they attach it as a separate PDF onto the email? Should they email you the photos individually? What would be the best course of action to make sure that you have all the information?
Yeah, it can be as a separate PDF. Just merge all those maps, photos, letters of support into a secondary PDF.
And like title like attachment 1 or something like that, so that you know to refer to.
Yeah, supporting documents would be fine.
Perfect, that works. And I answered this one, but I'm just going to confirm I answered it correctly. Is there a maximum number of grants and or total amount of money that will be rewarded or awarded? Or is it dependent on the rating of the application submitted?
So we almost never had a time where we didn't use the entire amount. So, you have to hit a certain point threshold to be considered fundable, which is 70%. So as long as you get 70% score, you will be considered eligible. And once we have all the different proposals received, they're going to be ranked, and we'll just start going down the line on funding. So if the top 5 projects all requested 5,000 and they validated it, that you could use up the entire allocated budget of 25,000. sometimes the board of directors will see if there's additional funding available and keep going down the list. But I can tell you, there's been a couple times where some projects were ranked high enough and they just didn't get funded because there was more ask than funding available.
Gotcha. And there's 25,000 available in this pot, correct?
But yeah, 25,000 budgeted for this year. So, minimum you would have 5 projects funded.
Gotcha.
But possibly more depending on the ask and the ranking.
Okay, perfect. In the application sections where the total word count is not stated, is each section a maximum of 300 words, or is that only pertaining to the first section?
To the sections that are specifically say 300, those are your limitations.
So there are some sections in there that do not have a maximum word count. Do they have a maximum word count or not? Just confirm.
No, but just note that, if you're going to go long, it could turn off reviewers because like Mark said, we can get a lot of proposals and it's a lot of effort to start looking at all of them. And so if a reviewer has one that's really well done and it's short, it might get higher scores than somebody that's, reading and reading and reading and reading. So I would say try to be as succinct as possible. But if there's something you feel is really, really important, go ahead and put it in there.
Awesome. And that was it for the questions that we've had today. So just want to go ahead and thank everybody for joining us today. We hope that you found this informative. We are going to be sending along a follow-up survey. So if you have a chance, please go ahead and fill that out. It really helps us know how we can do this a little bit better, what you guys are looking for, that kind of stuff. Again, if you have any follow-up questions to this webinar, it will be available on the website, and you can go ahead and email Bergman at irlcouncil.org, and she will help answer any questions you have. And with that, have a great rest of your week, everyone.